What if something inside you has already cracked open and you simply haven't noticed yet? Most people scroll past moments like this one. They keep running, keep chasing, keep drowning in noise. But you stopped. And that pause was not random. Some call it synchronicity. The instant when your inner world and the world around you line up without any plan, without force, without explanation. A quiet collision that happens exactly when it needs to. This is one of those instants, and it belongs to you. There are certain truths that only reach a person once. Not because they vanish from the world, but because the version of you able to receive them will not exist tomorrow. Not in some dramatic way, just shifted, quietly, invisibly. What could reshape you today may be nothing more than a forgotten footnote next week. The soul journey, as it's often called, is built from exactly these moments. Instances when something hidden breaks through to the surface, when a single sentence lands at precisely the right second and rearranges a life. Not because the words are magic, but because the listener was finally ready to hear them. Maybe today is that day for you. Stay to the end, not for anyone else, but for yourself. If something in these opening lines already stirred something in you, even without a name for it, that's the signal. That's proof this message arrived at the right time. You cannot schedule these moments. You cannot manufacture them on demand. They arrive like a language spoken only when you happen to be tuned to the right frequency. And when it speaks, it never shouts. It whispers once. Most people spend their whole lives waiting for the big cinematic turning point, the lightning strike, the instant when everything becomes clear all at once. But that is rarely how change actually works. The deepest shifts don't arrive with fireworks. They arrive quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of an unremarkable conversation, in a sentence you've heard 100 times before that suddenly, for no clear reason, lands differently. The sentence didn't change. You did. And without realizing it, you created space for something new to enter. Transformation isn't a single event. It's a slow, invisible process happening in layers so deep the conscious mind doesn't register it. Until one day you look in the mirror and don't quite recognize the person looking back. Not because you became someone else, but because you finally stopped pretending to be someone you were never meant to be. That's the beginning of waking up. And once it starts, there are things you can't unsee, patterns you can't keep ignoring, comfortable lies you can no longer sustain. A mind that has genuinely expanded does not shrink back down to fit the old shape. The trap is believing you get to decide when this moment shows up, that you can prepare for it, plan it, schedule it neatly into your calendar. Real turning points don't work around your agenda. They surface when the deeper, unconscious part of you is ready, and that timing belongs to no one. This is why so much weight gets placed on these strange coincidences, encounters with no tidy explanation that quietly redirect the whole shape of a life. Think of the last moment that truly shook you. You didn't plan it. You weren't hunting for it. It simply happened, and something inside you clicked into place, even though you couldn't say exactly what had been out of place before. That is happening right now as you take in these words, not because anyone timed it perfectly, but because something in you was already quietly searching. Not with words, not with a conscious request, but with a restlessness you couldn't quite name. And when something inside you searches, the world tends to answer. Maybe not the way you expected, but always, somehow, at the right time. This unfolding, the soul journey, is the path every person eventually has to walk, becoming not who they were trained to be, not who they assumed they were supposed to be, but who they actually are underneath every layer of adaptation, fear, and borrowed approval. It rarely starts with a grand gesture. It starts small. A video, a sentence, a silence. something that reaches a part of you that's been dormant for years and gently wakes it. And once that part is awake, there's no putting it back to sleep. Here's an uncomfortable truth nobody says out loud. Not every truth is available to you at every stage of life. Some truths only become accessible once you've reached a certain depth of internal maturity, once you've passed through certain experiences, once particular illusions have finally cracked. It's a bit like trying to describe a sunset to someone who has never seen the sky. The words exist. You can define it perfectly, but the impact only lands when you witness it yourself, in the right light, at the right moment. This is why a book that meant nothing to you at 20 can undo you completely at 40. The book never changed. You did. You finally reached the frequency required to actually receive it. The same is true of conversations, encounters, and messages. Some can only reach you once in an unrepeatable window because the version of you capable of receiving them is singular. When that version dissolves, the door closes. This isn't unfair. It's simply how growth works. There's an old idea that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But people forget the second half. When the student no longer needs the teacher disappears. Messages don't arrive to stay forever. They arrive to do one job: open a door, plant a seed. And once that's done, they move on. If this is landing for you right now, you probably already sense it. And if something here is resonating, consider passing it along. Not for anyone else's sock, but because sometimes a single message quietly redirects the whole course of someone's life. Just by staying present, just by listening, you could end up being that bridge for another person. This particular message will only find you once. Even if you replay it 100 times, even if you save it or share it, the real impact, the kind that shifts something underneath the surface, happens only in this first encounter, because this is the only time your current self will ever receive it exactly like this. That might sound dramatic, but it's simply accurate. Each experience reshapes us in small ways. Each choice turns us slightly into someone new. What shakes you today might be nothing more than a distant memory tomorrow. This is why staying present matters so much. Not postponing, not waiting for perfect circumstances, because the perfect moment is always right now. If you let it slide by, telling yourself you'll return to it later, it simply disappears, because the version of you able to receive it will no longer be there. Now comes the harder part. The part most people quietly avoid because facing it stings. But if you've made it this far, some part of you is already prepared to hear it. You may be living inside a loop, and this isn't your fault. It's a pattern that got instilled in you early. Trained to chase, to accumulate, to never quite feel satisfied with what you already have, because there's always something more, something better, something missing. You were told growth never ends, that there's always a next level, that nothing is ever truly enough, and you believed it. So now you exist on a kind of emotional treadmill. Every time you arrive somewhere, you're told the real destination is still further ahead. You keep running and running, but there's no actual arrival, because there was never supposed to be one. There is only here, and here was always enough. You just were never shown how to see it that way. People will go to remarkable lengths to avoid sitting quietly with their own inner life. One of the most sophisticated ways of avoiding it is to keep endlessly searching. Because as long as you're searching, you never actually have to stop and look at what hurts. You never have to sit with the emptiness you've been quietly carrying. It feels easier to watch another video, read another book, find another teacher, try another technique. Because that way you get to tell yourself you're doing the work. But often you're not doing the work. You're running from yourself. This isn't a judgment. It happens to almost everyone at some point, because it's the mind's most elegant defense. Protecting itself from the thing it fears most, stillness. That silence, the one with no more excuses and no more distractions, just you alone with yourself. That's the uncomfortable pause most people can't sit inside for long. And that's exactly where the real material lives, in that emptiness people try to fill with anything except their own presence. Being alone with yourself can feel unsettling because you were told for years that you weren't enough as you are, that you needed constant improving, optimizing, evolving, as though your worth were tied to visible progress. But your worth was never actually tied to any of that. You are already whole. You simply were never shown how to see it that way. There's a useful way to think about what people sometimes call the shadow. It isn't only the parts of yourself you're ashamed of, the impulses you hide, the fears you suppress. The shadow also holds everything good you never let yourself become. Every unexpressed gift, every quiet strength you were taught to shrink so you wouldn't stand out too much, so you'd fit in, adapt, stay small. In that constant effort to adapt, you may have clipped your own wings without meaning to, quieted your own voice, dimmed your own spark, and now part of you is living at half capacity, because the other half is still sitting in the shadows, waiting to be seen, waiting to finally be let back in. When you do integrate it, when you stop fighting yourself, when you accept that you hold both light and darkness, both strength and fragility, something settles. That settling is sometimes called coming home to the self, the real you, the core, the place where you no longer need masks because there's nothing left to hide, nothing to prove, nothing to defend. You simply exist, and that is enough. Getting there, though, usually means passing through some fire first. It means looking directly at what scares you, feeling what you've been avoiding, letting out the tears you swallowed, the frustration you silenced. It means accepting that you're not perfect and never will be, and realizing that this was never actually the problem. Perfection is an illusion, a gilded trap built by the anxious mind. Real freedom isn't found in being flawless. It's found in being real, uncomfortably, authentically, ruthlessly real. Once you give yourself permission to be that real, something shifts. Other people's opinions stop carrying quite so much weight. Not because you've grown cold, but because you've stopped needing their approval to feel whole. Your sense of worth stops depending on what anyone else thinks of you. That is one of the deepest freedoms available, not being emotionally dependent on another person's validation to feel complete. When two people meet, something like a chemical reaction can occur. And if it does, both people are changed by it. But that kind of transformation is only possible when both individuals are already relatively whole, when both have done some of their own inner work, faced some of their own shadow material. Two incomplete halves don't make a whole. They tend to make a dependency, and dependency dressed up nicely can look a lot like devotion, when really it's closer to fear. This is often why people who haven't done much internal work seek relationships purely to fill a gap, to feel less alone. And once they find someone, they grip tightly, because they're terrified of losing the one thing that seems to give their life meaning. But that isn't love. That's need. And need, over time, tends to suffocate. It leaves no room to breathe. Real connection tends to exist between two people who are already relatively complete on their own, who don't need each other to survive, but choose each other anyway. Not from lack, but from resonance. Not from fear, but from freedom. In that kind of bond, there's less drama, less jealousy, less need to control, because there's nothing being clung to out of desperation. Both people know they're free to leave at any time. And paradoxically, that freedom is often what keeps people together, because no one walks away from something that genuinely helps them grow. This is usually the point where a lot of people quietly disengage. Not because the ideas lose them, but because things start feeling too real, too close, too personal. Up until now, it may have sounded philosophical, something happening to other people that you could observe from a safe distance. But now comes the part where you have to look at yourself directly and admit something. This is uncomfortable because it means acknowledging that you may have been living on autopilot, repeating patterns you never consciously chose, carrying beliefs that were never really yours, playing a role instead of actually living your life. Admitting that isn't easy because it calls for responsibility. Not guilt, but responsibility. The capacity to respond, to choose, to change. Most people gravitate toward blame instead because blame is simpler. As long as someone else is responsible, you don't have to do anything. But there's no real liberation without responsibility. As long as you keep pointing outward, you stay stuck because you've effectively handed your power to other people. Let them decide your emotional state, handed them the keys to your own peace, and then lived at the mercy of whatever they say or do or think. Your life becomes one long reaction to the outside world instead of something you actively shape. But when you take responsibility back, something shifts, because you reclaim the power to choose how you respond, to decide what an experience actually means to you, to turn pain into something closer to wisdom. That kind of power can't be taken from you because it was never dependent on external circumstances. It only depends on how you process things internally. Once that really lands, you stop waiting for the world to change before allowing yourself to feel okay. You stop begging other people for what only you can actually give yourself. You start living from your own center instead. And that's roughly where real freedom begins. Real freedom doesn't arrive when circumstances finally become perfect. It arrives when you can hold on to your own peace, regardless of what's happening around you. Peace, in this sense, isn't the absence of problems. It's the presence of clarity, the ability to stand inside chaos without becoming the chaos, to be inside a storm without turning into the storm yourself. That kind of steadiness usually only comes through real internal work. Ruthless honesty, a willingness to look at what actually hurts, the courage to feel what you've spent years avoiding. There's no shortcut here, but it is the path that leads somewhere real. Not to a physical destination, but to an internal kind of home, a place you can finally rest in, finally just be, without judgment, without a mask. Simply you, in your plainest, most honest form. Something interesting tends to happen once you arrive there. You stop chasing things outward, because you've realized much of what you were looking for was already inside you all along. There's a particular kind of readiness some people describe. A quiet moment when the soul seems to reorganize itself without the conscious mind noticing, while something in the depths has been slowly ripening. Meanwhile, you keep living your ordinary life, unaware that you're standing right at the edge of change. It works a little like pressure building underground for years, invisibly, until it finally surfaces. No one nearby even realizes it's building until it does, and everything shifts. Human change can work the same way. There are internal shifts you can't predict or force. Once the pressure builds enough, once whatever's been sitting beneath the surface can no longer stay buried, it simply comes up. It asks no permission, waits for no convenient moment, and doesn't adjust itself to your schedule. It just arrives and forces you to finally look at what you've been avoiding. This is often why people end up in a personal crisis. Not necessarily because something terrible happened externally, but because something true erupted internally, something so real it dismantles every comfortable lie propping up daily life. And yes, that hurts. Of course it does. Holding on to a comfortable lie is almost always easier than facing an uncomfortable truth. Insisting everything's fine is simpler than admitting something is broken. Staying on autopilot feels safer than waking up and realizing you've been living a life you never fully chose. But eventually, the cost of pretending outweighs the cost of confronting things honestly. And that's usually the exact moment real change becomes almost inevitable. Some call this the confrontation with the shadow, that unavoidable meeting with everything you've denied, suppressed, or hidden out of shame or fear or guilt. And it's worth remembering, the shadow isn't only the dark material, it also holds every good thing you never let yourself become, because you were taught to stay small, not to shine too visibly, to keep adapting. In that long effort to adapt, you may have quietly clipped your own wings, lowered your own voice, dimmed your own spark. And now you're living at only part of your real capacity, while the rest waits in the shadows, wanting to finally be brought back into the light and made whole again. There comes a point where you have to admit that this hasn't been an ordinary stretch of reflection. Not filler, not simple entertainment. It's been more like a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They show you something, maybe something you didn't especially want to see, maybe something you've been quietly avoiding for years. But now that you've seen it, you can't pretend you haven't. That's both the difficulty and the gift of becoming more conscious. Once you've woken up to something, you can't fall back into the exact same sleep. You can try. You can distract yourself. You can keep pretending. But somewhere underneath, you'll know you're pretending. And living while knowing you're pretending is one of the more quietly exhausting kinds of suffering there is. Once you've truly confronted the parts of yourself you'd rather not look at, once you've recognized your own patterns and seen clearly how you've sometimes worked against your own interests, you can't keep operating with the same unconsciousness as before. It becomes a conscious choice from here on. And that changes everything. Because when you consciously choose to repeat an old pattern, the discomfort feels different. You can't blame anyone else anymore. You can't say you didn't know, because now you do. If you choose to keep going anyway, that responsibility belongs to you. That responsibility is both freeing and a little frightening, because it strips away your usual excuses. It pushes you to grow. It pushes you to choose. And choosing might be one of the harder things a person does, because every time you choose one path, you give up all the others. Part of the mind hates that, because it wants every option available at once, every path left open. But you can't have them all. You have to pick one and live with what follows. This is where a lot of people get stuck, afraid of choosing wrong, afraid of regret, afraid of loss. But there's another way to look at it. Not choosing is still a choice, and often the worst one, because when you don't choose, life tends to choose for you. And it usually picks whatever's most comfortable, most familiar, most already known, which is frequently exactly what you don't actually need. This is part of why people stay in jobs that drain them, relationships that exhausted them, lives that never quite felt like their own. Not for lack of options, but for lack of the nerve to choose differently. Because choosing is genuinely a little frightening. It's a kind of leap without knowing exactly where you'll land. But it's the only path that actually leads anywhere. Yes, you might fall. You might get it wrong. You might fail at first. But you might also rise. You might get it right. The only way to actually find out is to try. There's no shortcut, no guarantee, only a kind of faith. Faith in yourself, faith in your own process, faith that even a fall teaches you something and leaves you a little stronger, a little more honest than before. Every mistake, looked at honestly, tends to bring you a bit closer to the truth. And the truth, even when it stings a little, is almost always more freeing than the comfortable lie. If something inside you shifted while reading through this, even if you can't quite name what it was, even if you're still not sure what exactly moved, that shift is already doing its quiet work, whether or not you have words for it yet. The moment worth paying attention to is always this one, right now, because right now is really the only thing that ever exists. The past is finished. The future hasn't arrived. Only this moment is actually here, and what you choose to do with it shapes everything that follows. You are not some unfinished project waiting to be optimized into worthiness. You are already a complete work, Imperfect, certainly, carrying your own cracks and rough edges, but whole and real and enough, more than enough. If you found something useful in this, it might be worth sitting with quietly rather than rushing past it. Write down whatever surfaced, even if it's just a feeling without a name yet. Share it with someone if it feels right, not out of obligation, but because sometimes a single passage genuinely redirects the shape of someone else's day or week or year. You never really know in advance whose life a small message might gently nudge. You stayed until the end for a reason, even if that reason isn't fully clear to you yet. That's fine. Clarity tends to come later, often quietly, often in an ordinary moment you won't see coming, much like the moment that first got your attention here. This particular version of you, the one reading these final lines, is the one this message found. And that, in its own small way, was always the point.